The Gilded Age is produced by Universal Television and brought to you by HBO of Warner Media. All characters, plot points, and footage are property of HBO. The Gilded Age is a brand new drama airing exclusively on HBO Max. Join your friends at Free Tours by Foot as we take you through New York City, showing you actual locations from the show, locations in New York City the show is based around, discuss plot points, and go over the actual history of all of the events of the Gilded Age. And remember to book your tour with freetoursbyfoot.com the next time you visit New York City or any one of our other locations. And now, on to Katherine.
So if you are anything like me, you were waiting with bated breath for the second episode to drop of The Gilded Age. I was sitting there eyeing the clock, and the second it was available on HBO Max, there I was. So as we dive further in to the society of the Upper East Side during The Gilded Age, in this second episode, they started to touch on something that was very much a part of day-to-day life for the women in this society, both old money and new money. And that was working for charities. Women of this society, of course, were not expected to have any kind of professional income. They were ladies of leisure, but that doesn't mean they sat around all day. You were expected to use your wealth and your position for good. And so a lot of them would participate in various charities all over the city, and they would host charity bazaars like the one that you see in the second episode. And as is shown, this was where women from old money families and new money families really did start to come together a little bit. New money family women would use this opportunity as a chance to start to mix with high society in New York. And the old money women certainly wanted the checks that were written by some of those new money families. So the building that you can see in the background that looks like a castle is not a castle. That is actually the Park Avenue Armory. And so you heard it mentioned a lot of times in episode 2, and that was meant to be the site of the charity bazaar that these women were going to be throwing. And of course that fell through, and they had to go to the Fifth Avenue Hotel. So the Park Avenue Armory, unlike what you see in the show, was not just to be used for charity bazaars. This was an actual functioning armory. It was the home of the 7th Regiment of the New York State Militia. Now this armory was actually only 2 years old at the time that episode was meant to take place in 1882. This building was built in 1880. And it housed the 7th Regiment, but the 7th Regiment did have the unofficial nickname, the Silk Stocking Regiment. And that is because many of the people that were a part of the 7th Regiment were sons of the very wealthy Gilded Age families that lived here in this area, and it was thought to be a much more pampered regiment than many of its counterparts in New York State. So I am here now at beautiful Bethesda Terrace in Central Park. And so if you have seen episode 2 of The Gilded Age, you will definitely recognize this. This is where Marion Brooke and Peggy Scott come together to meet Marion's lawyer because Peggy says she has some legal questions. We are not privy to what those questions are yet. So far, they have not revealed a lot of Peggy Scott's storyline. We think that's probably coming up in the next couple of episodes. And I, for one, am very, very excited. So this area, Bethesda Terrace, would have been a completely acceptable place for a young society woman like Marion Brooke to be seen. And actually it would have been very easy for her to get to. She could have entered the park right from her home at 5th Avenue and 61st Street, and then walked across, and then walked up what we call the mall or the promenade, which finishes right here at Bethesda Terrace. And this was a very common place for society women to come and stroll and get fresh air. So this place here was considered by the designers of Central Park, Calvert Vaux and Frederick Law Olmsted, to be the heart of Central Park. It is not the geographic center, but they called it the heart of the park. And it is certainly very, very beautiful. And just for some context, Central Park was still relatively new at the time that this story is supposed to start. The Gilded Age starts in 1882. Central Park had only been finished in the 1870s, though parts of it were open as early as the late 1850s. Central Park was considered to be up in the countryside. In that very first episode, you actually saw the park a couple times as well. The sheep that you saw in the very first couple of seconds, those would have been over at the sheep meadow, which used to be used for grazing sheep, but also when you see the two aunts and Marion Brook on a carriage ride, that very likely was Central Park as well. This was a place where the wealthy of New York came to get some nature and some fresh air. Now, I have to give them points for accuracy, because when Marion is standing here with her young lawyer friend, they're talking about this statue, the Angel of the Waters statue. And exactly like he says in the show, this was designed by a woman named Emma Stebbins. It was the first public art commission for a woman. And this entire thing was done in honor of, in celebration of, New York City's Croton Aqueduct system. That was opened in 1842. It brought fresh drinking water into New York City. It was our first public water supply system, and it was considered an absolute saving grace for New York City. So you have this Angel of the Water statue that was commissioned in honor of that. Now, I have to tell you, I was so excited to see this scene in episode 2, because completely accidentally last spring, as I was strolling through taking in the cherry blossoms, I saw them filming it. I had no idea what was going on. I saw a bunch of people in 1880s costumes, and I figured something had to be up, and here we have the Gilded Age. So far in the first couple of episodes of the Gilded Age, the central conflict that has been set up is the clash between old money and new money in New York. And while the Van Ryns and the Russells are absolutely fictional families, they really are a good representative of this very, very real conflict that was going on in the upper echelons of New York society. And while the families are fictional, they do seem to be based on real families, at least partially. So the Russells are shown as being the new money arrivals on the Upper East Side. They've built their big palace on 61st Street. To me, it seems like the Russell family is very much based on the Vanderbilts. They actually even mention the Vanderbilts in the first episode as being the example for them as a new money family that is starting to work their way into New York high society. So the Vanderbilt family, in any conversation about the Gilded Age, will always come up as one of the primary examples of new money. The family was founded by Cornelius Vanderbilt. Cornelius Vanderbilt was born on Staten Island to a family of very modest means. He ended up starting initially a ferry company. He got into shipping, and he made his real fortune, though, with the railroads. The railroad industry is one you will also hear a lot about during the Gilded Age, and I think we're going to hear a lot more about it in the TV show as well, because the railroads were absolutely exploding in this country at the time. There was a lot of money to be made if you got in with shares in a railroad company, or you bought up existing railroads, merged them together. So the character George Russell in the Gilded Age is shown as being in the railroad business. And I do think while the family, the Russells, are very much based on the Vanderbilts, the character of George Russell has some qualities that you could attribute to various members of the Vanderbilt family, but he also has a lot of a real historic figure as well, named Jay Gould. Jay Gould is also one of the well-known, what we call robber barons of the time. So the term robber baron is one you'll hear a lot with the Gilded Age. It's not always used in a particularly flattering way. It's really meant to insinuate these were men that amassed an absolutely enormous amount of wealth, but through some sort of, by today's standards, shady means. In some of these cases, these people would use their immense wealth to influence political policy to their advantage, or just take advantage of the extremely lax regulations for businesses at the time. Some of them were making their money off of the backs of very seriously underpaying their workers, or by buying up their competitors and creating monopolies. Now, all of this would have been seen during the Gilded Age, and you actually start to see a little bit of it in episode 2 with Mr. Russell's character. He's having the meeting with the alderman who he's invited over for dinner, and he's starting to talk about, again, what would today be considered absolutely illegal business practices. Something to know is he's not really being set up to be this outlier. These were relatively common things to do for men in his position at the time. So the other character that I think is being set up to be emulated or is based on another historic figure, Mrs. Russell. I think is very much based on a member of the Vanderbilt family, Alva Vanderbilt. Alva Vanderbilt was married into the Vanderbilt family, and much like the character Mrs. Russell, seems absolutely bound and determined to break into that upper echelon of New York high society by any means necessary. And this really did happen with Alva Vanderbilt. The Vanderbilts, as new money, as railroad money, were not considered to be socially acceptable by old New York, what people would sometimes refer to as the New York 400. Alva Vanderbilt kind of just didn't take no for an answer. She built an absolute palace of a mansion in New York City, and her architect was said to have commented that this house wasn't meant to be a home. This house was a battering ram that she was going to use to enter high society. And she ended up in really this kind of clash of the titans with another very real figure in New York history, one who you have already seen a couple of times in both the first and second episode of The Gilded Age, and that is Mrs. Caroline Astor, or as she preferred to be called, the Mrs. Astor. There is no better embodiment of that old New York mentality than Caroline Astor. Caroline Astor married into the Astor family, and she was born as Caroline Webster Skirmerhorn. And so actually, even though the Astors had quite a bit of money that they were bringing to the marriage, Caroline was bringing the old New York pedigree. She was descended from what we would call one of the Knickerbocker families. The term Knickerbocker was used to describe families that had really had a hand in shaping and ruling this city from before it was even called New York, when it was New Amsterdam, descended from those original Dutch settlers. Caroline was absolutely a part of that group. So Caroline had very particular ideas about who was and who wasn't acceptable in New York society. To her, old money, absolutely not. And so you can see glimpses of this in the character of Mrs. Van Ryn in the show. She'll actually even say, we receive the old people, never the new. Very much the attitude Caroline Astor would have had as well. Caroline Astor was one of the people who perpetrated the idea of the New York 400, the 400 people who were socially acceptable in New York City. And so inevitably, you do have the clash of the old and the new that happened, and this did happen in real life between these two women, Alva Vanderbilt and Mrs. Caroline Astor. So this all came to a head in 1883 with two separate incidents, one involving the opera, one involving a party. So the winter season, the winter social season started in November, typically in New York City, following the summer season, which was usually in Newport. The official opening of the winter season, though, was the opening of the opera at the Academy of Music. This was an old institution. The Academy of Music only had 18 opera boxes, and because of the very limited number, they were absolutely restricted only to those very old money New York families. And the Vanderbilts, particularly Alva, desperately wanted one of these boxes, and she was blocked at every turn by Mrs. Caroline Astor. And in 1883, she decided enough was enough, and she gathered up all of the other people who had been snubbed by Mrs. Caroline Astor but had a lot of money, and there were plenty, and they came together and founded the Metropolitan Opera Company. The Metropolitan Opera House had 122 boxes, more than enough for everybody to have a box. And ultimately, the Metropolitan Opera Company is the one that won out. It still exists in New York City, although it is in a different location. And part of the reason for that was not the opera boxes, though certainly that helped. It was really just that the acoustics of the building were dramatically better than the Academy of Music. And if you're having an opera, then that's very important. So ultimately, the Met is the opera company that won out. The other clash between these two women, though, happened, like I said, with a party. Caroline Astor very, very famously refused to call on women who were not a part of this old New York moneyed set. She would not go, she would not leave her calling card, which, by the way, her calling card only said the Mrs. Astor. Most people, put their name and their last name, their first and last name, probably their address. All she put was the Mrs. Astor, because anybody who was anybody would know that meant her. So Alva Vanderbilt, when her mansion was completed, decided she was going to use her battering ram of a house, and she was going to finally enter New York high society. She threw a costume ball for 1,200 people inside her mansion. And just because of the sheer scale of it, this was the most talked about event of the entire social season. 1,200 people were coming. And you know who wasn't on that invite list? Caroline Astor and her daughter. Because officially, Caroline Astor had never called on Mrs. Vanderbilt, and so societal rules dictated she could not invite her to a party. Well, Caroline Astor's daughter desperately wanted to go to this social event of the season. She was even supposed to be performing with her friends in a dance as a part of this grand tableau. And so Mrs. Astor went with her card, the Mrs. Astor, dropped it at Alva Vanderbilt's house. Caroline and her daughter did attend the ball, and this was really seen, though, as Alva Vanderbilt's official acceptance into that very, very top tier of New York society. Her money may not have been old, but with Mrs. Astor's card in her hand, she had finally arrived. So one of the things you've already maybe noticed in the show in the first couple of episodes, there's a lot of discussion over the fashionable part of town versus the unfashionable part of town. And we're actually going to do a whole separate video on how the fashionable section of New York changed over the years. But the world of the show very much seems centric on the newer fashionable part of town, which was further up around 61st Street, where those houses are. But that sounds a little bit strange, because the queen of New York high society, Mrs. Caroline Astor, did not live in that part of town for the majority of her life. Her home, her brownstone, which you briefly see the interior of in both episode 1 and episode 2, was down at 34th Street and 5th Avenue. If that cross street sounds familiar to you, it's because now it is where the Empire State Building is located. Caroline's brownstone was down there, and it would have looked a lot more similar to what you see the Van Ryn house looking like, that brownstone, and even the interior, for as wealthy as she was, if you notice in those interior scenes, much more understated than what you see inside the Russell house. Now, Caroline actually had a very similar experience to what you see with the Van Ryns and the Russells, in that she had her understated but elegant brownstone, and then across the street, a new money family who had made their money in gasp department stores built this absolute marble palace across from her. Now, she wasn't going to bow down and create a marble palace, but she did go ahead and make some renovations to her brownstone just to emulate that lavish look that was starting to become a little bit more popular. So for Caroline Astor, for Alva Vanderbilt, all of these women, they were fascinating women, and there is a lot to know about them. So if you're curious and would maybe want to learn more about either of them or any of the other real characters that you see mentioned, like Mrs. Fish, who invites Larry to go to her Newport cottage in the first episode, the Livingstons, who Mrs. Van Ryn constantly references because they are her relatives. These are all real families. If you are interested in learning more about any of them, let us know in the comments, and we'll make sure we can accommodate that request so that you can learn as much as there is to know about some of the real people that lived in this era.